There's something rather fascinating happening beneath the surface of American foreign policy that virtually nobody's discussing. Donald Trump has spent the better part of 2 years constructing what he claims is the toughest Iran posture in decades, threatening strikes, deploying military assets, and issuing ultimatums that would make a 19th-century imperial diplomat blush. Yet, simultaneously, his administration has been quietly signaling through back channels that disengagement might be preferable to the grinding confrontation his own policies have created. The question that emerges from this contradiction isn't whether Trump will change course on Iran. The pattern suggests he's already doing precisely that. The genuine question is whether the costs of his impending retreat will prove catastrophic for both American credibility and regional stability when his withdrawal finally becomes public. What you're about to discover is how Trump's characteristic approach to conflict resolution, which we might charitably describe as unsustainable, has created a geopolitical trap from which his preferred escape routes have all collapsed. By examining the specific mechanisms that brought this moment about, we can understand not merely what happened, but what it reveals about the fundamental incompetence guiding current American foreign policy. The foundation of Trump's Iran approach rested upon a deceptively simple premise. Maximum pressure applied with sufficient intensity would force Iranian capitulation. When Trump withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2018, he argued the agreement represented capitulation to Iranian expansionism. His administration subsequently implemented sanctions regimes, amongst the most comprehensive ever imposed, targeting Iranian oil exports, banking systems, and industrial sectors. The logic appeared elegant in its severity. Bankrupt Iran's government through economic strangulation, and you force them to the negotiating table begging for terms. Sanctions did indeed devastate Iran's economy, causing currency collapse and GDP contraction. The administration's Treasury Department documented how these measures reduced Iranian oil exports from approximately 2.5 million barrels daily to fewer than 400,000 barrels at the program's nadir. This represented genuinely severe economic punishment, affecting the daily existence of Iran's 88 million citizens. Yet here's what the administration systematically failed to understand about how authoritarian governments actually respond to existential economic pressure. Contrary to the neoliberal assumption that economic pain produces political capitulation, regimes like Iran's typically react by consolidating control, redirecting resources toward security apparatus rather than civilian needs, and entrenching ideological commitments that become more, not less, rigid when facing foreign pressure. The Revolutionary Guards actually expanded their economic influence during the sanctions period, securing greater control over crucial sectors, whilst civilian authorities watched their authority erode. This perverse outcome, economic pressure strengthening the very forces most hostile to American interests, represents perhaps the most predictable failure mode of maximum pressure strategies. Yet it appears consistently to have surprised Trump administration officials who approached Iran policy from business negotiation templates rather than geopolitical understanding. What nobody anticipated, or perhaps more accurately what the administration failed to understand, was that Iran would respond to American maximum pressure by expanding precisely the activities America most wanted constrained. As Iranian government revenues collapsed, the Revolutionary Guards Corps expanded operations across Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, deepening military commitments that simultaneously drained state resources and increased regional destabilization. Iranian proxies increased attacks on American installations in Iraq. Drone and missile strikes on Saudi and Emirati targets intensified. The Houthis received enhanced military capabilities, allowing them to strike shipping across the Red Sea in ways that directly impacted global commerce. Each of these expansions represented Iran attempting to compensate for economic losses through geopolitical assertiveness. Yet none of these developments seemed to factor into whatever strategic planning might have existed within the administration. The economic foundation the Trump approach relied upon began deteriorating in 2020 with the arrival of COVID-19, which simultaneously reduced global energy demand whilst incentivizing China to violate American sanctions against Iranian oil purchases. By mid-2021, Iranian oil exports had begun recovering as Chinese demand compensated for Western sanctions compliance. Simultaneously, the administration's own internal divisions became increasingly visible. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo pushed for ever more aggressive confrontation, whilst the Pentagon quietly communicated that military options against Iran remained far more constrained and costly than public rhetoric suggested. General Mark Milley, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, appears to have privately resisted Pompeo's advocacy for military strikes repeatedly. The intelligence community assessed that military action against Iranian nuclear facilities would inevitably produce retaliatory cascades destabilizing the entire region. These internal assessments, compartmentalized from public discourse, created a peculiar situation where American deterrent credibility rested upon threats whose credibility American military leadership clearly did not themselves possess. This is where the framework becomes critical to understanding what's unfolding currently. Regional governments, sophisticated actors who pay considerable attention to international military capability, began calibrating their own behavior against what they understood about American constraints, rather than what American rhetoric claimed. Saudi Arabia cautiously improved relations with Iran. The UAE engaged in negotiations that America wasn't leading. Iraq increasingly asserted independence from American preferences. These weren't dramatic reversals, but rather a slow recalibration that suggested regional powers had accepted that American maximum pressure was neither working nor sustainable, and that hedging their bets made greater sense than depending on American commitments that subsequent administrations might reverse anyway. Now here's where the current situation becomes genuinely intriguing. The Biden administration, whilst maintaining the sanctions apparatus inherited from Trump, simultaneously moved toward indirect negotiations with Iran through Swiss intermediaries and Omani channels. These negotiations produced what America termed the Joint Plan of Action Framework, a less comprehensive agreement than the original JCPOA, but one that functionally reduced immediate escalation risks. Iran curtailed some uranium enrichment activities. America tacitly allowed certain petroleum exports to continue. The arrangement was neither capitulation nor triumph, but rather a return to what the previous administration had rejected: managed coexistence with controlled escalation potential. The crucial element, as multiple European observers noted at the time, was that this approach functionally acknowledged what American policymakers never publicly admitted: that maximum pressure had failed to achieve its strategic objectives. Trump's return to office appears to have generated within his circle considerable tension regarding Iran policy directions. On one hand, his ideological commitments to confrontation with Iran remain genuine, and his rhetorical style tends toward maximum belligerence. On the other hand, the actual operational capacity to sustain confrontation, the willingness to absorb costs that sustained conflict produces, and the broader foreign policy bandwidth required to manage regional instability all point toward the pattern that emerged throughout his first administration. Trump ultimately prefers abrupt disengagement to grinding commitments that don't produce rapid, visible victories. This characteristic pattern, which might be described charitably as pragmatic, but more accurately as mercurial, appears to be asserting itself once again regarding Iran. The specific signals of impending disengagement have been subtle but accumulating. The administration has reduced military asset deployments to the Persian Gulf, moving naval assets to operations elsewhere. Troop levels in Iraq have been publicly reduced. The bellicose rhetoric directed toward Iran has become noticeably less frequent in presidential communications. Most significantly, American officials have begun conveying through Middle Eastern intermediaries that the United States is open to talks with Iran regarding nuclear matters, provided such talks result in better terms than previous agreements. This formula, the insistence that renegotiation must produce subjectively superior outcomes, represents the standard language through which the Trump administration signals openness to disengagement, whilst maintaining surface credibility with its base. Translation: we're willing to negotiate down from our maximum demands, provided we can characterize the result as superior to previous agreements, regardless of actual substantive differences. The Iranian government, having experienced the first Trump administration, now understands this pattern rather well. Their recent diplomatic signaling has adopted carefully calibrated messaging designed to create the impression of movement sufficient to allow Trump to claim credit for achievements, whilst not requiring actual, substantial Iranian concessions. The Iranians have announced expanded discussions regarding uranium enrichment limitations, conveniently framed in ways that technically represent modifications to previous positions, whilst functionally maintaining levels very similar to those permitted under the Biden framework. The performance of negotiation proceeding without substantive movement represents the optimal outcome from Tehran's perspective, as it allows maximum pressure to be theatrically lifted whilst Iranian strategic position remains essentially unchanged. What becomes remarkable when examining this dynamic is how completely the Trump administration appears to have abandoned the ideological commitment to Iran confrontation that once animated its foreign policy. The abrupt pivoting reflects not strategic recalibration based on new information, but rather the characteristic pattern where Trump loses interest in conflicts incapable of swift resolution and creates extensive political vulnerability. Iran has proven resistant to the pressure mechanisms Trump favored. The economic costs of sustained confrontation impose burdens on American allies more than Iran itself, and the military option remains prohibitively risky. Having exhausted patience with this constraint reality, Trump appears prepared to exit the conflict through whatever agreement can be dramatized as superior to previous arrangements. Consider here the broader geopolitical implications of this pending disengagement. Throughout the Middle East, governments have been structuring alliances and security commitments partly based on assumptions about American willingness to maintain confrontation with Iran. Saudi Arabia accepted American military presence and coordination partly as counterweight to Iranian influence. The Emirates similarly aligned with American preferences. Israel structured its security strategy with American commitment to Iran containment as foundational assumption. The timing of Trump's apparent shift toward disengagement, occurring without prior consultation or coordination with these partners, represents a recurrence of the characteristic pattern where American foreign policy pivot points seem to arrive as uncomfortable surprises to nations that built strategies around previous American positions. The mechanics of how this disengagement will unfold suggests several probable developments. First, the Trump administration will likely reach some form of understanding with Iran that permits sanctions relief in exchange for vaguely defined nuclear restrictions. The agreement will be crafted in language sufficiently different from previous frameworks to allow Trump to claim it represents a superior outcome to Biden-era arrangements. The actual substantive restrictions on Iranian nuclear activity will likely prove marginally tighter than Biden frameworks, but considerably looser than Trump's original maximum pressure demands. Second, this agreement will emerge suddenly, with the administration presenting it as completed negotiation rather than lengthy process, allowing minimal opportunity for congressional scrutiny or allied coordination. Third, American military deployments to the region will be reduced further, reframed as reflection of improved security situation rather than withdrawn commitment. The consequences of this pattern will unfold across several interconnected domains. From an Israeli perspective, American disengagement from Iran confrontation represents potentially destabilizing development, as Israel's strategic planning has increasingly depended on American willingness to maintain pressure, preventing Iranian regional expansion. Israel will likely respond through unilateral military action against Iranian facilities or proxies, actions which the Trump administration will publicly oppose whilst tacitly permitting. The United States will thus simultaneously appear as partner in Israeli security, whilst avoiding direct responsibility for escalation, reflecting the administration's characteristic preference for maintaining contradictory positions simultaneously. Regarding Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, both nations have already begun hedging their positions through improving relations with Iran, independent of American preferences. This hedging accelerates substantially once American disengagement becomes explicit. The Abraham Accords, which the Trump administration celebrated as revolutionary alignment against Iran, will be revealed as ephemeral arrangements dependent upon American commitment that no longer exists. The Emirates will likely continue deepening economic and security relations with Iran that American rhetoric nominally opposed. Saudi Arabia will attempt to maintain balance between American alliance and Iranian accommodation. Neither will have substantial recourse, given their dependence on American military support, but both will quietly reduce the extent to which they subordinate their own interests to American preferences. From a broader alliance perspective, the disengagement represents further erosion of the systematic nature through which America's word represented reliable commitment. European nations, already skeptical of Trump administration reliability following previous pattern of abrupt policy reversals, will interpret this as further evidence that alliance commitments represent conditional arrangements dependent upon Trump's momentary attention rather than enduring commitments. This perception, whilst frustrating to American policymakers who genuinely believed themselves implementing coherent strategy, reflects the observable reality that administrations led by Trump do approach alliance relationships through transactional lens rather than institutional commitments. The Iranian calculation in this moment becomes somewhat intriguing from their perspective. They've exhausted American pressure without fundamentally altering their strategic position. They've built deeper relationships throughout the region precisely whilst American confrontation rhetoric remained loudest. They've watched as American maximum pressure failed to produce leverage for negotiation, and instead deepened Iranian entrenchment in regional expansion. Now they're witnessing American willingness to essentially accept current Iranian regional position in exchange for vaguely defined nuclear restrictions. From Iranian perspective, this represents successful strategic outcome, achieving relative regional position they desired whilst avoiding catastrophic military conflict. What's genuinely catastrophic from an American perspective is the broader pattern this represents. The United States has structured its entire post-Cold War strategy around the assumption that credible threats, sustained pressure, and demonstrated willingness to escalate would ultimately produce desired outcomes. Iran's experience now serves as demonstration case that this theory faces serious limitations when applied against regimes that lack vulnerable civilian pressure points and possess sufficient internal cohesion to absorb external pressure without fracturing. The alternative, which America appears to be returning toward, negotiated coexistence with partial acceptance of Iranian regional position, represents essentially accepting constraints on American power that the entire post-Cold War consensus denied should exist. This brings us to the deeper implications of Trump's pending disengagement. Throughout his foreign policy, the consistent pattern involves promising maximum commitment, applying pressure that proves insufficient, losing interest when rapid resolution fails to materialize, and then pivoting toward minimal viable outcome whilst attempting to characterize it as victory. With Iran, this pattern has now cycled through its complete arc. The pressure phase lasted sufficiently long to damage the region and America's relationships within it, but not long enough to produce the capitulation Trump apparently believed inevitable. Having exhausted patience, disengagement now becomes attractive despite having abandoned the strategic objectives maximum pressure claimed to pursue. This represents not flexibility, but rather the inability to sustain focus on complex strategic commitments, with consequences that reverberate through alliances and regional relationships structured around previous American positions. The mechanism through which this disengagement will occur deserves specific examination, because it reveals how American foreign policy increasingly operates through performance of negotiation rather than substantive adjustment. The administration will likely announce negotiations on nuclear restrictions, present preliminary agreement after brief period designed to signal rapid success, and position Trump as deal maker who achieved better terms than predecessors. The agreement will include elements sufficiently superficially different from Biden-era frameworks to support claims of superiority. Yet the actual operational implications, Iranian nuclear program trajectory, regional Iranian activities, American military posture, will shift only marginally from current baselines. This performance of change, without substantive change, represents the characteristic mode through which contemporary American foreign policy manages strategic failure. Regional governments watching this unfold will rationally conclude several things. First, American commitment to particular regional positions depends substantially on which administration currently occupies the White House. Second, maximum pressure from America can be survived through determined resistance and regional diversification. Third, America's power to dictate outcomes has declined more substantially than American rhetoric acknowledges. These conclusions, whilst unfortunate from American perspective, follow logically from observable American behavior. The cumulative effect across regions and time creates the systematic erosion of American credibility that makes future commitments appear less valuable to potential partners, who must weigh American promises against demonstrated American behavior. Bringing this together, the pending disengagement from Iran confrontation represents not isolated policy reversal, but rather expression of fundamental characteristics driving current American foreign policy dysfunction. The administration approaches complex strategic challenges through lens of dramatic negotiation and personal deal-making, rather than systematic understanding of how power operates in specific contexts. Maximum pressure strategies reflect belief that sufficient economic or military coercion will produce desired political outcomes, a belief contradicted across multiple cases. Loss of interest in conflicts that don't produce rapid, visible victories reflects attention span insufficient for sustained engagement with complex strategic challenges. Willingness to pivot toward negotiated outcomes, vastly inferior to original stated objectives, whilst attempting to characterize them as victories, reflects the contradictions between rhetorical commitment and operational capacity. What should concern observers of American foreign policy most fundamentally is that these patterns have now repeated consistently across multiple administrations and multiple regional contexts. The approach to Iran merely extends previously demonstrated patterns regarding China trade negotiations, Venezuela policy, Korean Peninsula diplomacy, and countless other areas where maximum pressure strategies failed to produce intended outcomes. Rather than generating recalibration toward approaches better suited to constraints American power actually faces, each failure simply produces renewed application of proven ineffective strategies to new contexts. For Iran specifically, the approaching disengagement will likely produce several consequences worth noting. First, it will validate Iranian strategies of resistance and regional diversification, making future Iranian governments even more confident that patience and strategic depth can overcome American pressure. Second, it will further entrench Iranian Revolutionary Guard's control over state economic and security apparatus, as American disengagement removes one of the few pressure points that might have created opportunities for more moderate Iranian voices. Third, it will accelerate regional realignment toward multipolar arrangements less dependent on American underwriting, developments already underway but now proceeding without American leverage to shape their direction. Fourth, it will create renewed instability as regional actors attempt to position themselves within the emerging arrangement. The genuine tragedy in this pattern is that alternative approaches to Iran policy remain available. Approaches that might actually produce outcomes closer to American objectives than either maximum pressure or abrupt disengagement. These alternatives would involve sustained engagement, recognition of constraints on American power and influence, and acceptance that some Iranian regional activities cannot be eliminated, though they might be modulated through consistent diplomacy and incentive structures. Yet these approaches require precisely the qualities contemporary American foreign policy demonstrates least capacity for: sustained strategic patience, acceptance of limited outcomes, and honest assessment of constraints on American power. The absence of these qualities in current political environment ensures that pendulum swings between maximum pressure and abrupt disengagement represent the operative range of American policy, with all the consequent costs to American credibility and regional stability. Looking forward, Trump's disengagement from Iran confrontation will likely occur within the next 6 to 12 months, as the administration requires sufficient time to set stage for claimed negotiation success, but insufficient time that opponents can credibly challenge the arrangement's terms. The agreement, when announced, will be presented as historic diplomatic achievement requiring Trump's deal-making genius. The substantive difference from Biden-era arrangements will prove marginal. The American media ecosystem will largely accept the administration's framing without rigorous examination of actual terms. Within regional capitals, the real message will arrive clearly. American commitment to particular positions depends upon American administration, and that commitment can be tested through determined resistance. The patterns evident in Trump's approaching Iran disengagement represent not merely this administration's failures, but rather larger dysfunctions within American foreign policy apparatus itself. A system that repeatedly applies ineffective pressure strategies, loses interest in complex commitments, and pivots toward inferior negotiated outcomes, whilst attempting to characterize them as victories, reveals fundamental incapacity to sustain the strategic depth and patience that modern great power competition requires. Whether Iran policy specifically or broader geopolitical trajectory generally, the implications involve gradual American retreat from positions of influence and alliance relationships that have anchored American power since 1945. This retreat proceeds not through deliberate strategic choice to withdraw, but rather through demonstrated incapacity to sustain the commitments that American global position requires. The question posed at this video's beginning, whether Trump is about to exit the Iran conflict, answers itself with remarkable clarity when examined through this analytical lens. Not merely is he about to exit, the exit has already begun, and what remains is merely the theatrical presentation of disengagement as diplomatic achievement. What should concern observers is not this particular case, but rather what it reveals about the broader incapacity that now characterizes American foreign policy. When maximum pressure fails repeatedly, when strategic commitments lack staying power, when negotiations conclude with outcomes inferior to original objectives, the fundamental issue involves not particular policy choices, but rather the system that generates those choices. Trump's pending disengagement from Iran represents merely the latest expression of a pattern sufficiently consistent that it might be considered not policy choice, but rather operating characteristic. And when great powers begin operating according to such characteristics, the implications for global stability prove substantial indeed.